Theme 12: Colonial Cities, Urbanization, Planning, and Architecture. In this chapter, we will discuss the process of urbanization in colonial India, explore the distinguishing characteristics of colonial cities, and track social changes within them. We will look closely at development in three big cities. Madras means Chennai, Calcutta means Kolkata, and Bombay means Mumbai. All three were originally fishing and weaving villages. They became important centers of trade due to the economic activities of the English East India Company. Company agents settled in Madras in 1639 and in Calcutta in 1690. Bombay was given to the company in 1661 by the English king, who had got it as part of his wife's dowry from the King of Portugal. The company established trading and administrative offices in each of these settlements. Southeast view of Fort St. George, Madras, by Thomas and William Daniel, based on a drawing by Daniel published in Oriental Scenery 1798. European ships carrying cargo. The horizon country boats can be seen in the foreground. By the middle of the 19th century, this settlement had become big cities from where the new rulers controlled the country. Institutions were set up to regulate economic activity and demonstrate the authority of the new rulers. India experienced political dominations in new ways in these cities. The layout of Madras, Bombay, and Calcutta were quite different from older Indian towns, and the buildings that were built in these cities bore the marks of their colonial origin. What do buildings express and what can architecture convey? This is a question that a student of history need to ask. Remember that architecture helps in giving ideas a shape in stone, brick, wood, or plaster. From the bungalow of the government officer, the palatial house of the rich merchant, to the humble hut of the laborer. Building reflect social relation and identities in many ways. Escaping to the countryside. This is how the famous poet Mirza Ghalib described what the people of Delhi did when the British forces occupied in city in 1857, smiting the enemy and driving him before them, the victors, that is the British, overran the city in all directions, all whom they found in the street they cut down. For 2 to 3 days, every road in the city, from the Kashmiri Gate to Chandni Chowk, was a battlefield. Three gates, the Ajmeri, the Turkoman, and the Delhi, were still held by the rebels. At the naked spectacles of this Bhengpur worth and malevolent hatred, the color filled from men's faces, and a vast concourse of men and women took to precipitate flight through these three gates. Seeking the little villages and shrines outside the city, they drew breath to wait until such time as might favor their return. One Towns and cities in pre-colonial times. Before we explore the growth of cities in the colonial period, let us look at urban centers during the centuries preceding British rule. What gave towns their character? Towns were often defined in opposition to rural areas. They came to represent specific form of economic activities and culture. In the countryside, people subsisted by cultivating land, foraging in the forest, or rearing animals. Down by contrast to our people with artisans, traders, administrators, and rulers. Town dominated over the rural population, thriving on the surplus and taxes derived from agriculture. Towns and cities were often fortified by walls, which symbolized their separation from the countryside. However, the separation between town and country was fluid. Peasants traveled long distance on pilgrimage, passing through towns. They also flocked to towns during time of famine. Besides, there was a reverse flow of humans and goods from town to villages. When towns were attacked, people often sought shelter in the countryside. Traders and peddlers took goods from the towns to sell in the villages, extending markets and creating a new pattern of consumption. During the 16th and 17th centuries, the town built by the Mughals were famous for their concentration of population, their monumental building, and their imperial grandeur and wealth. Agra, Delhi, and Lahore were important centers of imperial administration and control. Mansabdar and Jagirdar, who were assigned territories in different parts of the empire, usually maintained houses in these cities. Residence in the centers of power was symbolic of the status and prestige of a noble. The presence of the emperor and noblemen in this center meant that a wide variety of services had to be provided. Artisans produced exclusive handicrafts for the households of noble. Grain from the countryside was brought into urban market for the town dwellers and the army. The treasury was also located in the imperial capital. Thus, the revenue of the kingdom flowed into the capital regularly. The emperor lived in a fortified palace, and the town was enclosed by a wall, with entry and exit being regulated by different gates. Within these towns were gardens, mosques, temples, tombs, colleges, bazaars, and caravanserais. The focus of the town was oriented towards the palace and the principal mosques. In the towns of South India, such as Madurai and Kachipuram, the principal focus was the temple. These towns were also important commercial centers. Religious festivals often coincided with fairs, linking pilgrimage with trade. Generally, the ruler was the highest authority and the principal patron of the religious institution. The relationship that he had with other groups and classes determined their place in society and in the town. Shahjahanabad in 1857, the walls that surrounded the city was demolished after 1857. The Red Fort is on the riverside at a distance on the ridge to the right. You can see the British settlement and the cantonment. Medieval towns are places where everybody was expected to know their position in the social order, dominated by the ruling elite in North India. Maintaining this order was the work of the imperial officer called the Kotwal, who oversaw the internal affairs and policing of the town. The Kotwal of Delhi. Did you know the first Prime Minister of India, Jawaharlal Nehru's grandfather, Gangadhar Nehru, was the Kotwal of Delhi before the revolt of 1857? Read Jawaharlal Nehru autobiography for more details. Changes in the 18th century. All this started changing in the 18th century with political and commercial realignments. Old towns went into decline and new towns developed. The gradual erosion of Mughal power led to the demise of towns associated with their rule. The Mughal capitals, Delhi and Agra, lost their political authority. The growth of new regional powers were reflected in the increasing importance of regional capital. Lucknow, Hyderabad, Seringapatam, Pune, present-day Pune, Nagpur, Baroda, present-day Vadodara, and Tanjore, present-day Thanjavur. Traders, administrators, artisans, and others migrated from the old Mughal center to these new capitals in search of work and patronage. Continuous warfare between the new kingdoms meant that mercenaries too found ready employment there. Some local notable and official associated with Mughal rule in North India also used this opportunity to create new urban settlements such as the Qasba and Ganj. However, the effect of political decentralization were uneven. In some places there was renewed economic activity. In other places where plunder and political uncertainty led to economic decline. Qasba is a small town in the countryside, often the seat of a local notable. Ganj refers to a small fixed market. Both Qasba and Ganj dealt in cloth, fruits, vegetables, and milk products. They provided for noble families and the army. Changes in the network of trade were reflected in the history of urban centers. The European commercial companies had set up base in different places early during the Mughal era. The Portuguese in Panaji in 1510, the Dutch in Masulipatanam in 1605, the British in Madras in 1639, and the French in Pondicherry, present-day Puducherry, in 1673. With the expansion of commercial activity, towns grew around this trading center. By the end of the 18th century, the land-based empires in Asia were replaced by the powerful. A view of the city of Goa from a river by J. Gregg, 1812. Sea-based European empires, forces of international trade, mercantilism, and capitalism now came to define the nature of society. Names of cities. Madras, Bombay, and Calcutta were the anglicized names of villages where the British first set up trading posts. They are now known as Chennai, Mumbai, and Kolkata respectively. From the mid-18th century, there was a new phase of change. Commercial centers such as Surat, Masulipatanam, and Dhaka, which had grown in the 17th century, declined when trade shifted to other places as the British gradually acquired political control after the Battle of Palashi in 1757, and the trade of the English East India Company expanded. Colonial port cities such as Madras, Calcutta, and Bombay rapidly emerged as a new economic capital. They also become centers of colonial administration and political power. New buildings and institutions developed, and the urban spaces were ordered in the new ways. New occupations developed, and people flocked to these colonial cities by about 1800. They were the biggest cities in India in terms of population. Discuss which buildings, institutions, or place is the principal focus of the town, city, or village in which you live. Explore its history, find out when it was built, who built it, why it was built, what function it served, and whether this function have changed. Comment this. Finding out about colonial cities, colonial records, and urban history. Colonial rule was based on the production of enormous amount of data, and British kept detailed records of their trading activities in order to regulate their commercial affairs. To keep track of life in the growing cities, they carried out regular surveys, gathered statistical data, and published various official reports. From the early years, the colonial government was keen on mapping. It felt that good maps were necessary to understand the landscape and know the topography. This knowledge would allow better control over the region. When towns began to grow, maps were prepared not only to plan the development of this town, but also to develop commerce and consolidate power. The town maps give information regarding the location of hills, rivers, and vegetations, all important for planning structure for defense purposes. They also show the location of guard, density and quality of houses, and alignment of roads used to gauge commercial possibilities and plan strategies of taxation. From the late 19th century, the British tried to raise money of administering towns through the systematic annual collection of municipal taxes. To avoid conflict, they handed over some responsibilities to elected Indian representatives. Institutions like representation were meant to administer essential services such as water supply, sewerage, road building, public health. The activities of municipal corporation in turn generated a whole new set of records maintained in municipal record rooms. The growth of cities was monitored through regular head counts. By the mid 19th century, several local censuses had carried out the different regions. The first all India census was attempted in 1872. Thereafter, from 1881, decennial conducted every 10 years, censuses become a regular feature. The collection of data is an invaluable source for studying urbanizations in India. An old map of Bombay, the encircled area marked Castle, was part of the fortified settlement. The dotted areas show the seven islands that were gradually joined through projects of reclamations. Plan of Bombay, Colaba, and Sion. When we look at these reports, it appears that we have hard data to measure historical changes. The endless pages of tables on disease and death, or the enumeration of people according their age, sex, caste, and occupation, provide a vast mass of figures that creates an illusion of concreteness. Historians have, however, found that the figures can be misleading. Before we use this figure, we need to understand who collected the data and why and how they were gathered. We also need to know what was measured and what was not. The census operation, for instance, was a means by which social data was converted into convenient statistics about the population, but this process was riddled with ambiguity. The census commissioners devised categories for classifying different sections of the population. This classification was often arbitrary and failed to capture the fluid and overlapping identities of people. How was a person who was both an artisan and a trader to be classified? How was a person who cultivated his land and carted produce to the town to be enumerated? Was he a cultivator or a trader? Often people themselves refused to cooperate or gave evasive answer to the census official. For a long while they were suspicious of census operations and believed that inquiries were being conducted to impose new taxes. Upper caste people were also unwilling to give any information regarding the women of their households. Women were supposed to remain secluded within the interior of the household and not subjected to public gaze or public inquiry. What maps reveal and conceal? The development of survey method, accurate scientific instrument and British imperial needs meant that maps were prepared with great care. The Survey of India was established in 1878. While the maps that were prepared give us a lot of information, they also reflect the bias of the British rulers. Large settlements of the poor in town were unmarked on maps because they seemed unimportant to the rulers. As a result, it was assumed that these blank spaces on the map were available for other development schemes. When the schemes were undertaken, the poor were evicted. Census officials also found that people were reclaiming identities that they associated with higher status. For instance, there were people in town who were hawkers and went selling small articles during some some seasons, while in other seasons they earned their livelihoods through manual labor. Such people often told the census enumerators that they were traders, not laborers, for they regarded trade as a more respectable activity. Similarly, the figures of mortality and disease were difficult to collect, for all deaths were not registered, and illness was not always reported nor treated by a licensed doctor. How then could cases of illness or death be accurately calculated? Comment this. Thus, historians have to use sources like the census with great caution, keeping in mind their possible biases, recalculating figures, and understanding what the figures do not tell. However, census, survey maps, and records of institutions like the municipality help us to study colonial cities in greater detail than is possible for pre-colonial cities. Trends of change. A careful study of censuses reveals some fascinating trends. After 1800, urbanizations in India was sluggish. All through the 19th century up to the first 2 decades of the 12th 20th, the proportion of the urban population to the total population in India was extremely low and had remained stagnant. This is clear from figure 12.5. In the 40 years between 1900 and 1940, the urban population increased from about 10% of the total population to about 13%. Beneath this picture of changelessness, there were significant variation in the patterns of urban development in different regions. The smaller towns had little opportunity to grow economically. Calcutta, Bombay, and Madras, on the other hand, grew rapidly and soon became sprawling cities. In other words, the growth of these three cities as a new commercial and administrative center was at the expense of other existing urban centers. Urbanizations in India 1891 to 1941. Year percentage of urban population to total population. 1891 9.4, 1901 10, 1911 9.4, 1921 10.2, 1931 11.1, 1941 12.8. As the hub of the colonial economy, they function as collection depots for the export of Indian manufacturers such as cotton textiles in the 18th and 19th centuries. After the Industrial Revolution in England, this trend was reversed and the cities instead became the entry point of British manufactured goods and for the export of the Indian raw materials. The nature of this economic activity sharply differentiated these colonial cities from India's traditional towns and urban settlements. The introduction of railways in 1853 meant a change in the fortunes of towns. Economic activity gradually shifted away from traditional towns which were located along old route and river. Every railway station became a collection depot for raw materials and a distribution point for imported goods. For instance, Mirzapur on the Ganges, which specialized in collecting cotton and cotton goods from the Deccan, declined when a railway link was made to Bombay. See chapter 10, figures 10.18 and 10.19. With the expansion of the railway network, railway workshop, railway colonies were established. Railway towns like Jamalpur, Walter, and Bareilly developed. Discuss. Study either some statistical data or maps of a city. Check who collected the data and why they were collected. What are the possible biases in such collections? What kind of information is excluded? For maps, find out why they were drawn and whether they were equally detailed for all parts of the city. Comment this. The Bora Bazar in the port area, Bombay, 1885. A Bombay grew, even the port area became congested. Traders, shopkeepers, and service groups flowed into the area. Numerous bazaars were established and lofty structures came up. Worried by the congestion, the British made several attempts to push Indians out of the northern part of the port where the local communities had settled. What were the new towns like? Ports, forts, and centers for services. By the 18th century, Madras, Calcutta, and Bombay had become important ports. The settlements that came out here were convenient points for collecting goods. The English East India Company built its factories, that is, mercantile offices. there, and because of competition among the European companies fortified this settlement for protection. In Madras, Fort St. George; in Calcutta, Fort William; and the Bombay, the Fort mark out the areas of British settlement. Indian merchants, artisans, and other workers who had economic dealings with European merchants lived outside these forts and settlements of their own. Thus, from the beginning, there were separate quarters for Europeans and Indians, which came to be labeled in contemporary writings as the White Town and Black Town, respectively. Once the British captured political power, these racial distinctions became sharper. The old Fort Ghat in Calcutta, engraving by Thomas and William Daniel, 1787. The old fort was on the waterfront. The company's goods were received here. The ghat continued to be used for bathing purposes by the local people. From the mid 19th century, the expanding networks of railway linked these cities to the rest of the country. As a result, the hinterland, the countryside from where raw materials and labor were drawn, become more closely linked to these port cities, since raw materials was transported to these cities for export and there was plentiful cheap labor available. It was convenient to set up modern factories there. After the 1850s, cotton mills were set up by Indian merchants and entrepreneurs in Bombay, and European owned jute mills were established on the outskirts of Calcutta. This was the beginning of modern industrial development in India. Although Calcutta, Bombay, and Madras supplied raw materials for industry in England and had emerged because of modern economic forces like capitalisms, their economic were not primarily based on factory production. The majority of the working population in the cities belong to what economists classify as the tertiary sectors. There were only two proper industrial cities: Kanpur, specializing in leather, woolen, and cotton textile, and Jamshedpur, specializing in steel. India never became a modern industrialized country since discriminatory colonial policies limited the levels of industrial developments. Calcutta, Bombay, and Madras grew into large cities, but this did not signify any dramatic economic growth for colonial India as a whole. Ionic was one of the three orders, means organizational systems of ancient Greek architecture, the other to being Doric and Corinthian. One feature that distinguished each order was the style of the capital at the head of the columns. These forms were readapted in the Renaissance and neoclassical forms of architecture. Doric capital, Ionic capital, Corinthian capital. A new urban milieu. Colonial cities reflected the mercantile culture of the new rulers. Political power and patronage shifted from Indian rulers to the merchants of the East India Company. Indians who worked as interpreters, middlemen, traders, and suppliers of goods also had an important place in this new city's economic activity near the river or the sea led to the development of docks and ghats. Along the shore were godowns, mercantile offices, insurance agencies for shipping, transport depots, banking establishments. Further, inland were the chief administrative offices of the company. The Writers' Building in Calcutta was one such office. Around the periphery of Fort, European merchants and agents built palatial houses in European style. Some built garden houses in the suburbs. Racially exclusive clubs, racecourses, and theatres were also built for the ruling elite. The old courthouse and Writers' Building, engraving by Thomas and William Daniel, 1786. The courthouse on the right with an open arcaded veranda and ionic columns was pulled down in 1792. Next to it is the Writers' Building where the East India Company servants in India known as writers stayed on arrival in the country. Later this building became a government office. New buildings at Chourangi means Chourangi, engraving by Thomas and William Daniel 1787 along the stony side of the maiden private houses of the British began coming up in the late 18th century. Most were in a Palladian style with pillared verandas that were meant to keep up the summer heat. The rich Indian agents and middlemen built large traditional courtyard houses in the Black Town in the vicinity of the bazaar. They brought up large tracts of land in the city was future investment. To impress their English master, they threw lavish parties during festivals. They also built temples to establish their status in society. The laboring poor provided a variety of services of their European and Indian masters as cooks, palanquins bearers, coachmen, guards, porters, and construction and dock workers. They lived in makeshift huts in different parts of the city. The nature of the colonial city changed further in the mid-19th century. After the revolt of 1857, British attitudes in India were shaped by a constant fear of rebellion. They felt that towns needed to be better defended, and white people had to live in more secure and segregated enclaves away from the threat of the natives, pasture lands, and agricultural fields. Around the older towns were cleared and new urban spaces called civil lines were set up. White people began to live in the civil lines cantonments, places where Indian troops under European commands were stationed, were also developed as safe enclaves. These areas were separate from but attached to the Indian towns with broad street bungalows set Amidst large garden, barracks, parade ground, and church, they were meant as a the Marble Place, Calcutta. This is one of the most elaborate structure built by an Indian family belonging to the new urban elite. Chitpur Bazaar by Charles Dowley. Chitpur Bazaar was at the border of Blacktown and Whitetown in Calcutta. Notice the different types of houses here, the brick buildings of the wealthy landlord and the thatched huts of the poor. The temple in the picture, referred to by the British as the Black Pagoda, was built by a landlord, Govindaram Mittal, who lived here, shaped by the language of race. Even names were often colored with blackness. Look at the figures and notice the variety of activities on the street. What do the activities tell us about the social life on the street of Calcutta in the late 18th century? Comment this. Safe haven for Europeans as well as a model of adult urban life in contrast to the densely built up Indian towns. For the British, the black areas came to symbolize not only chaos and anarchy, but also filth and disease. For a long while, the British were interested primarily in the cleanliness and hygiene of the white areas. But as epidemics of cholera and plague spread, killing thousands, colonial officials felt the need for more stringent measures of sanitation and public health. They feared that disease would spread from the black to the white areas from the 1860s and 1870s. Stringent administrative measures regarding sanitation were implemented and building activity in the Indian towns regulated. Underground piped water supply, sewerage and drainage system were also put in place around this time. Sanitary vigilance thus became another way of regulating Indian towns. The first hill stations. As the case of cantonments, hill stations were distinctive features of colonial urbanization development. The founding and settling of hill stations were initially connected with the needs of the British Army. Shimla, present-day Shimla, was founded during the course of Gurkha Wars 1815 to 16. The Anglo-Maratha Wars of 1818 led to British interest in Mount Abu, and Darjeeling were wrested from the rulers of Sikkim in 1835. Hill stations became strategic places for piloting troops, guarding frontiers, and launching campaigns against enemy rulers. A typical colonial house in Shimla and early 20th century photograph, most probably it was the residence of Sir John Marshall. The temperate and cool climate of Indian hills was seen as an advantage, particularly since the British associated hot weather with epidemics. Cholera and malaria were particularly feared, and attempts were made to protect the army from these diseases. The overwhelming presence of the army made these stations a new kind of cantonments. In the hill, these hill stations were also developed as sanitariums, that is, places where soldiers could be sent for rest and recovery from illness. Because the hill station approximated the cold climates of Europe, they became an attractive destination for the new rulers. It became a practice for viceroys to move to hill station during the summer month. In 1864, the Viceroy John Lawrence officially moved his council to Simla, setting seal To the practice of shifting capitals during the hot season, Simla also became the official residence of the commander-in-chief of the Indian Army. In the hill stations, the British and other Europeans sought to recreate settlements that were reminiscent of home. The buildings were deliberately built in the European style. Individual houses followed the pattern of detached villas and cottages set amidst gardens. The Anglican church and educational institutions represented British ideals. Even recreation activities came to be shaped by British cultural traditions. The social calls, teas, picnics, fetes, races, and visits to the theatres became common among colonial officials in the hill stations. A village near Manali, Himachal Pradesh, while the British introduced colonial architectural style in the hill station, the local population often continued to live as before. The introduction of railways made hill station more accessible to a wide range of people, including Indians, upper and middle class Indians such as Maharajas, lawyers, and merchants were drawn to these stations because they afforded them a close proximity to the ruling British elite. Hill stations were important for the colonial economy with the setting up of tea and coffee plantations in the adjoining areas and an influx of immigrant labor from the plains began. This meant that hill stations no longer remained exclusive racial enclaves for Europeans in India. Trams in a road in Calcutta. Social life in the new cities. For the Indian population, the new cities were bewildering places where life seemed always in a flux. There was a dramatic contrast between extreme wealth and poverty. New transport facilities such as horse-drawn carriage and subsequently trams and buses meant that people could live at a distance from the city center. Over time, there was a gradual separation of the place of work from the place of residence. Traveling from home to office or the factory was a completely new kind of experience. Also, though the sense of coherence and familiarity of the old towns was no longer there, the creation of public places, for example, public parks, theaters, and from the 20th century cinema halls, provided exciting new forms of entertainment and social interactions. Within the cities, new social groups were formed, and the old identities of people were no longer important. All classes of people were migrating to the big cities. There was an increasing demand for clerks, teachers, lawyers, doctors, engineers, and accountants. As a result, the middle classes increased. They had access to new educational institutions such as schools, colleges, and libraries. As educated people, they could put forward their opinions on society and government in newspapers, journals, and public meetings. A new public sphere of debate and discussions emerged. Social customs, norms, and practices came to be questioned. Amar Katha means my story. Binodini Dashi, 1863 to 1941, was a pioneering figure in Bengali theatre in the late 19th and early 20th century and worked closely with the dramatist and director Girish Chandra Ghosh, 1844 to 1912. She was one of the prime movers behind the setting up of the Star Theatre, 1883. In Calcutta, which became a center for famous production. Between 1910 and 1913, she realized her autobiography Amar Kotha means my story, a remarkable personality. She exemplified the problem women faced in recasting their roles in society. She was a professional in the city working in multiple spheres as an actress, institutions builder, and author. But the patriarchal society of the time scorned her assertive public presence. Social changes did not happen with age cities, for instance, offered new opportunities for women. Middle class women shouted to express themselves through the medium of journals, autobiographies, and books. But many peoples resented this attempt to change traditional patriarchal norms. Conservatives feared that the education of women would turn the world upside down and threaten the basics of the entire social order. Even reformers who supported women's education saw women primarily as mothers and wives and wanted them to remain within the enclosed space of the household. Over time, women became more visible in public as they entered new profession in the city as domestic and factory workers, teachers, and theaters and film actors. But for a long time, women who moved out of the household into public spaces remained the objects of social censure. Another new class within the cities was the laboring poor or the working class. Paupers from rural areas flocked to the cities as the places of the opportunity. Others were attracted to the allure of a different way of life by the desire to see things they had never seen before. To minimize cost of living in the city, most male migrants left their families behind in their village homes. Life in the city was a struggle, jobs and uncertain, food was expensive, and places to stay were difficult to afford. Yet the poor often created a lively urban culture of their own. They were enthusiastic participants in religious festivals. Tamashas means folk theatres, and songs means satires, which often mocked the presentations of their masters, pretension of their masters, Indian and European. At late 19th century Kalighat painting, male anxiety about female power was often expressed through the figure of the woman as a charmer who transformed men into sheep. A woman began to be educated and moved out of the speculation of their homes. Such images of women began to proliferate in popular prints. Discuss what is the railway station closest to your residence? Find out when it was built and whether it was built to transport goods and people. Ask older people what they know about the station. How often do you go to the station and why? Comment this. Through the eyes of poor migrants. This is a song that was popular amongst the inhabitants of Jelepara, means fisherman quarters, Calcutta in the early 20th century. दिल में एक भावना से कलकत्ता में आई कैसे कैसे मजा हम यहाँ देखा पाई अड़ी समाज ब्रह्म समाज गिरजा मस्जिद एक लोटा में मिलता दूध पानी सब्जी छोटा बड़ा आदमी सब बाहर करके दट झटपट मार के बोलता है अंग्रेजी में बत with anticipation in my heart I came to Calcutta and what entertaining things I could see here. The Arya Samaj, Brahma Samaj, church and monks in one vessel you get everything, milk, water and all. All men, big and small, showed their teeth, and with a flourish they speak in English. For segregation, town planning, and architecture, Madras, Calcutta, and Bombay. Madras, Calcutta, and Bombay gradually developed in the biggest cities of colonial India. We have been examining some of the distinctive features of these cities in the preceding section. Now we will look in cities in the Now we will look in detail at one characteristics for each city. Settlement and segregation in Madras. The company had first set up its trading activities in the well-established port of Surat on west coast. Subsequently, the search for textile brought British merchants to the east coast. In 1639, they constructed a trading post in Madraspatam. This settlement was locally known as Chennapattanam. The company had purchased the right of settlement from the local Telugu lords, the Nayaks of Kalahasti, who were eager to support trading activity in region. Rivalry 1746 to 63. With the French East India Company led the British to fortify Madras and give their representative increased political administrative functions. With the defeat of the French in 1761, Madras became more secure and began to grow into an important commercial town. It was here that the superiority of the British and the subordinate position of the Indian merchants were most apparent. For St. George became the nucleus of the White Town, where most of the Europeans lived. Walls and bastions made these a distinct enclave. Color and religion determined who were allowed to live within the fort. The company did not permit any marriage with Indians. Other than the English, the Dutch, and Portuguese were allowed to stay here because they were European and Christian. The administrative and judicial system also favored the white population. Despite being few in numbers, the Europeans were the rulers, and the development of Madras followed the need and convenience of the minority whites in the town. The Black Town developed outside the fort. It was laid out in straight lines, the characteristics of colonial towns. It was, however, demolished in mid-17th and the areas was cleared for a security zone around the fort. A new Black Town developed further to the north. This housed weavers, artisans, middlemen, and interpreters who played a vital role in the company trade. A map of Madras, the White Town around Fort of St. George, is one the left and the old Black Town is one of the right. Fort St. George is marked with a circle. Notice how the Black Town was laid out. Part of the Black Town, Madras by Thomas and William Daniel based on a drawing by Daniel published in Oriental Scenery 1798. The old Black Town was demolished to create the open space you see in this picture. Originally cleared as a line of fire, the open ground was later maintained as a green area on the horizon. You can see part of the new Black Town that came up at a distance from the fort. The new Black Town resembled traditional Indian towns with living quarters built around its own temple and bazaar. On the narrow lanes, the crisis crossed and township. There were distinct caste specific neighborhoods. Chintatriptet was an area meant for weavers. Washermanpet was a colony of dyers and bleachers of cloth. Rayapuram was a settlement for Christian boatmen who worked for the company. Pet is a Tamil word meaning settlement, while Puram is used for a village. Madras developed by incorporating innumerable surrounding villages and by creating opportunities and spaces for a variety of communities. Several different communities who came and settled in Madras performing a range of economic functions. The Dubases were Indians who could speak two languages, the local language and English. They worked as agents and merchants acting as intermediaries between Indian society and the British. They used their privileged position in government to acquire wealth. Their powerful position in society was established by their charitable works and patronage of temples in the Black Town. Initially, jobs with the company were monopolized by the whalers, a rural caste who took advantage of the new opportunities provided by British rule. With the spread of English education in the 19th century, Brahmins started competing for similar position in the administration. Telugu Comites were a powerful commercial group that controlled the grain trade in the city. Gujarati bankers had also been present since the 18th century. Prayers and Banayers from the laboring poor. The Nawab of Arcot settled in nearby Triplicane, which became the nucleus of a substantial Muslim settlement. Mylapore and Triplicane were earlier Hindu religious center that supported a large group of Brahmin. Santhom, with its cathedral, was the center for Roman Catholics. All these settlements became part of Madras city. Thus, the incorporation of many villages made Madras a city of wide expansion and low density. This was noticed by European travelers and commented on by officials. A garden house on Punamelli Road. A rural city. Read the excerpt on Madras from the Imperial Gazetteers, 1908. The better European residences are built in the midst of compound which almost attain the dignity of parks, and rice fields frequently wind in and out between these in almost rural fashion. Even in the most thickly peopled native quarters such as Blacktown and Tiplicane, there is little of the crowding found in many other towns. Statements in reports often express the idea of the reporter what kind of an urban spaces in the reporter celebrating in the settlement statement and what kind is demeaning. Would you agree with these ideas? Comment this. As the British consolidated their power, resident Europeans began to move out of the port. Garden houses first started coming up along the two main arteries, Mount Road and Punamalli Road, leading from the port to the cantonment. Wealthy Indians too started to live like the English. As a result, many new suburbs were created from existing villages around the core of Madras. This was, of course, possible because the wealthy could afford transport. The poor settled in villages that were close to their places of work. The gradual urbanizations of Madras meant that the areas between these villages were brought within the city. As a result, Madras had a semi-rural air about it. Town planning in Calcutta. Modern town planning began in the colonial cities. This required preparation of a layout of the entire urban space and regulation of urban land use. Planning was usually inspired by a vision of what the city should look like, how it would be developed, and the way in which spaces would be organized and ordered. The ideology of development that this vision rejected perceived exercise of state power over urban lives and urban spaces. There were many reasons why the British took upon themselves the task of town planning from the early years of their ruling in Bengal. One immediate reason was defense. In 1756, Sirajuddaula, the Nawab of Bengal, attacked Calcutta and sacked the small fort which the British traders had built as their depot for goods. The English East India Company traders had been continuously questioning the sovereignty of the Nawab. They were reluctant to pay customs duties and refused to comply with the terms on which they were expected to operate. So, Sirajuddaula wanted to assert his authority. Subsequently, in 1757, when Sirajuddaula was defeated in the Battle of Plassey, the East India Company decided to build a new fort, one that could not be easily attacked. Calcutta had grown from three villages called Shutanoti, Kolkata, and Govindpur. The company cleared a site in the southernmost village of Govindpur, and the traders and weavers living there were asked to move out. Around the new Fort William, they left a vast open space which came to be locally known as the Maidan or Garden Mast. The line of fire. Interestingly, the pattern devised for Calcutta was replicated in many other towns during the revolt of 1857. Many towns became rebel strongholds. After their victory, the British proceeded to make these places safe for themselves. In Delhi, for instance, they took over the Red Fort and stationed an army there. Then they destroyed buildings close to the fort, creating a substantial empty space between the Indian neighborhoods and the fort. The logic was the same as in Calcutta 100 years ago. A direct line of fire was considered essential just in case the town rose up against Firangi Raj once again. This was done so that there would be no obstruction to a straight line of fire from the fort against an advancing enemy army. Once the British became more confident about their permanent presence in Calcutta, they started moving out of the fort and building residences along the periphery of the Maidan. That was how the English settlement in Calcutta gradually started taking shape. The vast open space around the fort, which still exists, became a landmark, Calcutta's first significant town planning measures. The story of town planning in Calcutta, of course, did not end with the building of Fort William and the Maidan. In 1798, Lord Wellesley became the Governor General. He built a massive palace, Government House, for himself in Calcutta, a building that was expected to convey the authority of the British. He became concerned about the conditions of Indian part of the city, the crowding, the excessive vegetation, the dirt tanks, the smells and poor drainage. These conditions worried the British because they believed at the time that poisonous gases from marshlands and pools of stagnant water were the cause of most diseases. The tropical climate itself was seen as unhealthy. Government House, Calcutta by Charles Doyle, 1848. The residence of Governor General, the Government House, built by Wellesley, was made by to symbolize the grandeur of the Raj. A bazaar leading to Chitpur Road in Calcutta for local communities in the towns. The bazaar was a place of both commercial and social exchanges. Europeans were fascinated by the bazaar but also saw it was an overcrowded and dirty place. For the regulation of nuisance of every description. By the early 19th century, the British felt that permanent and public rules had to be formulated for regulating all aspects of social life. Even the construction of private buildings and public roads ought to conform to standardized rules that were clearly codified. In his Minute on Calcutta, 1803, Wellesley wrote, "It is a primary duty of government to provide for the health, safety, and convenience of the inhabitants of these great towns by establishing a comprehensive system for the improvement of roads, streets, public drains, and water courses, and by fixing permanent rules for the constructions and distributions of the houses and public edifices, and for the regulations of nuisance of every description." And innovating, creating open places in the city was one way of making the city healthier. Wellesley wrote, "A minute means a administrator order." In 1803, on the need for town planning and set up various committees for the purpose. Many bazaar, ghat, burial grounds, and tanneries were cleared or removed. From then on, the notion of public health became an idea that was proclaimed in projects of town clearance and town planning. After Wellesley's departure, the work of town planning was carried on by the Lottery Committee, 1817. With the help of the government, the Lottery Committee was so named because funds for town improvement were raised through public lotteries. In other words, in the early decades of the 19th century, raising funds for the city was still thought to be the responsibility of public-minded citizens and not exclusively that of the government. The Lottery Committee commissioned a new map of the city so as to get a comprehensive picture of Calcutta. Among the committee's major activities was road building in the Indian part of the city and clearing the river bank of encroachments. In its drive to make the Indian areas of Calcutta cleaner, the committee removed many huts and displaced the laboring poor, who were now pushed to the outskirts of Calcutta. The threat of epidemics gave a further impetus to town planning in the next few decades. Cholera started spreading from 1817, and in 1896 plague made its appearance. This cause of this disease had not yet been established firmly by medical sciences. The government proceeded on the basis of the accepted theory of the time that there was a direct correlation between living condition and the spread of disease. Such views were supported by prominent Indian merchants in the city, such as Darkanath Tagore, Rustomji, Chowasji, who felt that Calcutta needed to be made more healthy. Densely built areas were seen as unsanitary since they obstructed direct sunlight and circulation of air. That was why working people's hearts or bastis became the target of demolition. The poor in the city, the workers, hawkers, artisans, porters, and the unemployed, were once again forced to move to distant parts of the city. Frequent fires also led to stricter building regulations. For instance, thatched houses were banned in 1836 and tiled roofs made mandatory. How does Wellesley define the duty of the government? Read this section and discuss what impact these ideas, if implemented, would have had on the Indians living in the city. Comment this. Basti in Bengali and Hindi originally meant neighborhood or settlement. However, the British narrowed the sense of word to mean makeshift huts built by the poor. In the late 19th century, bastis and insanitary slums became synonymous in British records. By the late 19th century, official intervention in the city became more stringent. Gone were the days when town plan was seen as a tax to be shared by inhabitants and the government. Instead, the government took over all the initiatives for town planning, including funding. These opportunities were used to clear more hearths and develop the British portions of the town at the expense of the odd other areas. The existing racial divide of the white town and black town was reinforced by the new divide of healthy and unhealthy. Indian representatives in the municipality protested against their unfair bias toward the development of the European parts of the town. Public protest against these government policies strengthened the feeling of anti-colonialism and nationalism among Indians. A part of the European town in Calcutta, after the lottery committee improvements from the plan by J.S. Sketch 1825, you can see the European houses with compounds. A basti in Calcutta. With the growth of their empire, the British became increasingly inclined to make cities like Calcutta, Bombay, and Madras into impressive imperial capitals. It was as if the grandeur of the cities had to reflect the authority of imperial power. Town planning had to represent everything that the British claimed to stand for: rational ordering, meticulous executions, and Western aesthetic ideals. Cities had to be cleaned and ordered, planned and beautiful. Architecture and Bombay. If one way of realizing the imperial visions was through town planning, the other was through embellishing cities with monumental building. Building in cities could include forts, government offices, educational institutions, religious structures, commemorative towers, commercial depots, or even docks and bridges, although primarily serving functional needs like defense, administration, and commerce. These were rarely simple structures. They were often meant to represent ideas such as imperial power, nationalisms, and religious glory. Let us see how this is amplified in the case of Bombay. Bombay was initially seven islands. As the population grew, the islands were joined to create more spaces and they gradually fused into one big city. Bombay was the commercial capital of colonial India. As the premier port on the western coast, it was the center of international trade. By the end of the 19th century, half the imports and exports of India passed through Bombay. One important item of this trade was opium that the East India Company exported to China. Indian merchants and middlemen supplied and participated in this trade, and they helped integrate Bombay's economy directly to Malwa, Rajasthan and Sindh, where opium was grown. This collaboration with the company was profitable and led to the growth of an Indian capitalist class. Bombay's capitalists came from diverse communities such as Parsi, Marwari, Konkani Muslim, Gujarati, Baniya, Bohra, Jew, Armenian. As you have read chapter 10, when the American Civil War started in 1861, cotton from the American South stopped coming into the international market. This led to an upsurge of demand for Indian cotton, grown primarily in the Deccan. Once again, Indian merchants and middlemen found an opportunity for earning huge profit. In 1869, the Suez Canal was opened, and this further strengthened Bombay's links with the world economy. The Bombay government and Indian merchants used this opportunity to declare Bombay's Ars Prima in Indies, a Latin phrase meaning the most important city of India. By the late 19th century, Indian merchants in Bombay were investing their wealth in new ventures such as cotton mills. They also patronized building activity in the city. As Bombay economy grew from the mid 19th century, there was a need to expand railways and shipping and develop the administrative structure. Many new buildings were constructed at this time. These buildings reflected the culture and confidence of the rulers. The architecture style was usually European. The importations of European styles reflected the imperial visions in several ways. First, it expressed the British desire to create a familiar landscape in an alien country and thus to feel at home in the colony. Second, the British felt that European styles would best symbolize their superiority, authority, and power. Third, they thought that building that looked European would mark out the difference and distance between colonial masters and their Indian subjects. A bungalow in Bombay, 19th century. Initially, these buildings were at odds with the traditional Indian buildings. Gradually, Indians too got used to European architecture and made it their own. The British star adopted some Indian style to suit their needs. One example is a bungalow which was used by government officers in Bombay and all over India. The name bungalow was derived from Bangla, a traditional thatched Bengali hut. The colonial bungalow was set on extensive ground which ensured privacy and marked a distance from the Indian world around. The traditional pitched roof and surrounding veranda kept the bungalow cool in the summer months. The compound had separate quarters for a retinue of domestic servants. The bungalows in the civil lines thus becomes a racially exclusive enclave in which the ruling classes could live self-sufficient lives without daily social contact with Indians. The town hall in Bombay, which now houses the Asiatic Society of Bombay. For public buildings, three broad architectural styles were used. Two of these were direct import from fashion prevalent in India, England. The first was called neoclassical or the neo. Classical. Its characteristics included construction of geometrical structures fronted with lofty pillars. It was derived from a style that was originally typical of buildings in ancient Rome and was subsequently revived, readapted, and made popular during the European Renaissance. It was considered particularly appropriate for the British Empire in India. The British imagined that a style that embodied the grandeur of imperial Rome and could now be made to express the glory of imperial India. The Mediterranean origins of these architectures were also thought to be suitable for tropical weather. The town hall in Bombay was built in this style in 1833. Another group of commercial buildings built during the cotton boom of 1860s was the Elphinstone Circle, subsequently named Hardiman Circle after an English editor who courageously supported Indian nationalists. This building was inspired from models in Italy. It made innovative use of covered arcades at ground level to shield the shopper and pedestrian from the fierce sun and rain of Bombay. Pitched roof is a term used by architects to describe a sloping roof. By the early 20th century, pitched roof became less common in bungalows, although the general plan remained the same. The Elphinstone circles note the pillars and arches derived from the Garcio-Roman, Gallico-Roman architecture. Another style that was extensively used was the Neo-Gothic, characterized by high-pitched roof, pointed arches, and detailed decoration. The Gothic style had its roots in buildings, especially churches, built in northern Europe during the medieval period. The Neo-Gothic or New Gothic styles were revived in the mid-19th century in England. This was the time when the government in Bombay was building its infrastructure, and this style was adapted for Bombay. An impressive group of buildings facing the seafront, including the Secretariat, University of Bombay, and High Court, were all built in this style. Indian gave money for some of this building. The university hall was made with money donated by Sir Chowasji Jahangir Reddy money. A rich Parsi merchant, the university library clock tower was similarly funded by the banker Premchand Roychand and was named after his mother as Rajabai Tower. Indian merchants were happy to adopt the neo-Gothic style since they believed that building style, like many ideas brought in by the English, were progressive and would help make Bombay into a modern city. However, the most spectacular example of the neo-Gothic style in the Victoria Terminus, the station and headquarters of the Great Indian Peninsular Railway Company, the British Bombay Secretariat, designed by H. St. Clair Wilkins, drawing from the builders, 20 November 1875. Invested a lot in the design and construction of railway stations in cities since they were proud of having successfully built on all India railway network As a group, these buildings dominated the central Bombay skyline, and their uniform neo-Gothic style gave a distinctive character to the city. Victoria Terminus railway station designed by F. W. Stevens. Towards the beginning of the 20th century, a new hybrid architecture style developed which combined the Indian with the European. This was called Indo-Saracenic. Indo was shorthand for Hindu and Saracen was a term Europeans used to designate Muslim. The inspiration for this style was medieval building in India with their domes, chhatris, jalis, arches. By integrating Indian and European styles in public architecture, the British wanted to prove that they were legitimate rulers of India. The Gateway of India, built in the traditional Gujarati style to welcome King George V and Queen Mary to India in 1911, is the most famous example of this style. The industrialized Jamshedji Tata built the Taj Mahal Hotel in a similar style, besides being a symbol of Indian enterprise. This building became Madras Law Court, while Bombay remained the main center of Gothic revival. Indo-Saracenic flourished in Madras. The design of the law courts combined Pathan elements with Gothic ones. A challenge to racially exclusive clubs and hotels maintained by the British. In the more Indian localities of Bombay, traditional styles of decoration and buildings predominated. The lack of space in the city and crowding led to a type of building unique to Bombay. The chawl, the multi-storied single-room apartments with long open corridors built around a courtyard, such building which housed many families. Sharing common spaces helped in the growth of neighborhood identity and solidarity. The Municipal Corporation Building, Bombay, designed by F. W. Stevens in 1888. Notice the fusion of Oriental and Gothic design. What buildings and architectural styles tell us? Architecture reflects the aesthetic ideals prevalent at a time and variation within those ideals, but as we have seen, buildings also express the vision of those who build them. Rulers everywhere seek to express their power through buildings. So by looking at the architecture of a particular time, we can understand how power was conceived of and how it was expressed through structures and their attributes. Bricks and stones, pillars and arches, soaring domes or vaulted roofs. A Bombay chawl. Discuss, choose a historical building that you admire, list its architectural attributes, and find out about the style and why the particular style was adopted. Comment this. Architectural styles do not only reflect prevalent tastes, they mold tastes, popularize styles, and shape the contours of culture. As we have seen, many Indians came to regard European styles of architecture as symbols of modernity of civilizations and began adopting these styles, but not all Indians thought alike. Many rejected European ideas and tried to retain indigenous style. Others accepted certain elements from the West that they show as modern and combine this with elements drawn from local tradition. From the late 19th century, we see effort to define regional and national tastes that were different from the colonial ideas. Styles thus changed and developed through wider processes of cultural conflict. By looking at architecture, therefore, we can also understand the variety of forms in which cultural conflicts unfolded and political conflicts between the imperial and the national and the regional or local were played out. Timeline 1500 to 1700. European trading companies established based in India, Portuguese in Panaji. In 1510, the Dutch in Masulipatanam, 1605, the British in Madras, 1639, the Bombay, 1661, and the Calcutta in 1690, the French in Pondicherry, 1673. 1757, decisive victory of British in the Battle of Plassey. The British became rulers of Bengal. 1773, Supreme Court set up in Calcutta by the East India Company. 1784, Asiatic Society founded by Sir William Jones. 1793, Cornwallis Code enacted. 1803, Lord Wellesley Minute on Calcutta Town's improvement. 1818, British takeover of the Deccan. Bombay becomes the capital of the new province. 1853, railway from Bombay to Thane. 1857, first spinning and weaving mill in Bombay. 1857, university in Bombay, Madras and Calcutta. 1870s, beginning of elected representatives in municipalities. 1881, Madras Harbour completed. 1896, first screening of a film in Watson Hotel, Bombay. 1896, plague start spreading to major cities. 1911, transfer to capital from Calcutta to Delhi. Answer in 100 to 150 words. Do this. Write a short essay 250 to 300 words on the following. Comment this. Map work. On an outline map of India, trace the major rivers and hill ranges. Plot 10 cities mentioned in the chapter, including Bombay, Calcutta and Madras, and prepare a brief note on why the importance of any two cities that you have marked, one colonial and one pre-colonial, changed in the 19th century. Comment this. Project, choose one. 11. You have been reading about big colonial cities. Choose any small town with a long history. It could be a temple town, market town, administrative town, a pilgrimage center, or a combination of this. Find out how the town was established, when it developed, and how its history changed during modern times. Comment this. 12. Choose 5 different types of building in your town or village. For each of these, find out when it was built, how it was planned, how resources were obtained for its construction, and how long it took to build it. What do the architectural feature of the buildings expresses? Comment this.